Guys, Miss Miklos here, and today it's time for the semester one final review. And so what I'm going to be doing, I'm going to go through some really general things on what you need to know, and then I'm going to go through each chapter and kind of highlight some major concepts that are necessary for you to know. The first thing that I want to stress is the importance of getting an 85% in this class, because that is the prerequisite to get into honors pre-calc. Now, I know a lot of you guys have higher aspirations, which is great, but I just want to stress that 85% is kind of a key value. So if you're the person that's at like an 87 and you're thinking, shoot, I can't get an A, keep in mind that you still need to study because 85% is the cutoff. Second thing I wanted to highlight real quickly is just this really easy formula to know what you need to get on the final exam. So it basically is 5 times the grade you want minus 4 times the grade you have. Now keep in mind, we haven't taken our final chapter test yet, so if you do this with your grade now, that'll give you a general idea, but it'll be much more specific if you wait until after that chapter test is in. The first part of our final exam is a multiple choice test, and there are 40 questions overall, and yes, E, none of the above is an option. I know that's everyone's favorite. And this portion is worth 2/3 of the grade. So on this portion, you are filling out a Scantron. I'm not giving you points for your work. It is just strictly on if you get the right answer or not. You will still have a test that you can write on just to show all your work, but I will not personally be grading it. So this is the first portion of the test. The second portion of the test is a free response portion. There are 8 questions. However, don't let those 8 questions fool you. I would definitely say these are the more difficult questions, the more time-consuming questions. That's why even though there are less questions, this is worth 1/3 of your grade. Okay, on the free response, this is like the majority of our tests where there's a question and I'm grading all of your work. As I talk about each chapter from here on out, my suggestion is in class we will have a little bit of time to go through specific questions, but I would also look back on that particular chapter review video or even on that particular lecture and kind of rewatch that to make sure that you know what's going on. Oh yeah, and one last thing. There's definitely no note card on our final. Okay, it's not like geometry where there's a million things to memorize, so no note card on the final. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about chapter 1. Chapter 1 started with properties, so that was like commutative, associative, identity, inverse. So that's the first thing that you guys definitely need to make sure you know. The next thing is Martian math, and that was our chart stuff, where it gave you a specific chart, and you had to go through and figure out, is it closed? Is there an identity? Is there an inverse? Is it commutative? Okay, there's not very much of this on one of the review worksheets, so I would make sure that you go back and practice this concept specifically. Next thing that we have is our star stuff. So X star Y, where we had to figure out is star associative, is star commutative. Definitely, I think this was one of the tougher sections for a lot of you guys over this particular semester. So I would spend some time, go back, figure out how we go about using star. Next, solving equations for X. These were just some basic algebraic equations that we had to deal with. So it is important that we just know how to solve some basic equations, definitely with distributing and just pretty basic steps. The last concept in chapter 1 deals with solving and graphing inequalities. Remember, we put these on the number line. We had some that were simple, and then we had some that were compound, where we had and problems and or problems. Okay, so this sums up chapter 1. I want to stress you guys, if I don't talk about it, don't study it. I promise, even though I'm not being super specific, I am giving you every single concept that you need to make sure to know. So moving on to chapter 2, the first concept that you have to deal with is evaluating functions. So that deals with function notation like f of x equals a specific expression. And then it might say like find f of 3. So that's telling us we need to substitute 3 in wherever there's an x. Next, there's a lot of graphing. We talked a lot about graphing just lines, so whether it was in standard form or it was in slope-intercept form. We also talked about inequalities and how we graph those, and those were with shading and with solid lines and dashed lines. And then we dealt with absolute value, and those were the functions that form a V shape. The next concept that we graphed were piecewise functions. And that's when we had two parts of the graph that dealt with different domains. So it was a function because for each x value there was only one y value. But I think this was probably the most difficult thing that we did in this particular chapter. So I would definitely spend some time making sure you know how to do that. The final concept from chapter 2 deals with writing equations of lines, and it will make you write them in standard form because it is on the multiple choice section, so that is how it is going to be written. It could be that there's a slope and an ordered pair. It could be that there are two ordered pairs. So this is kind of where our knowledge of slope comes into play. I will let you know that there are no parallel or perpendicular lines, so don't stress about those. Chapter 3 dealt with solving systems of equations, and so that really is the key thing you need to know how to do from that section. Okay, so remember we learned how to use graphing, substitution, linear combination, and also Cramer's rule. You also need to know how to evaluate determinants. So that's when something is already set up for you and we use Mr. Determifish and it is subtract baby. So that's what we need to go ahead and make sure we know how to use as well. The final concept from chapter 3 was our distance equals rate times time word problem. This was the one where we had to make the chart and like X was like the rate of the airplane and Y was the rate of the air, and we had to figure all that out. This was on our chapter test. Definitely make sure you know how to do one of those. Chapter 4 was when we dealt with our 3x3 systems. And the first thing you guys need to know how to do is how to solve 3x3 systems. So once again, we used really substitution, linear combination, and Cramer's rule. We really focused on Cramer's rule and linear combination in this chapter. The other concept you need to know is how to evaluate a 3x3 determinant. So that's when we went ahead and we rewrote out the first two columns outside of our nice little absolute value looking symbol. We started in the top left-hand corner, multiplied across the diagonals, then did the opposite and multiplied across the diagonals from the top right. Okay, so really short chapter, not a ton of concepts on it. Make sure you study and know how to do these two. Chapter 5 was, in my opinion, one of the tougher chapters of this semester. And even though it's recent, I think you should spend a lot of time going through this. First thing we learned are imaginary numbers. So definitely we know we should never keep I squared, I cubed, anything like that in our answer. We also know the square root of a negative is imaginary. The next thing we learned about was complex conjugates, and we really had to deal with that when we had an imaginary value in our denominator. And this is how we got rid of it. Remember, complex conjugates have the same two terms, but their sign in between is opposite. There will definitely be some problems where we need to solve either using completing the square or the quadratic formula. So I would advise making sure you know both, but definitely make sure you know at least one of those. Next, we learned how to use the discriminant. And remember, that was b squared minus 4ac. And that really told us what type of answers we were going to get. So whether they were 2 real, 1 real, or 2 imaginary. In chapter 5, we also learned how to graph parabolas. And just a reminder that when we're graphing them, knowing how to find the 4 characteristics is really important. So I would also expect to see one where we need to complete the square in order to get it in the right form. So just make sure that I know how to do that. I know how to graph it. I know how to list all the characteristics. Lastly, we did a lot of factoring in this chapter. So I would definitely make sure that I know how to factor both the stuff we did in chapter 5 and chapter 6. So keep practicing that. That should be pretty fresh in our minds. And all this factoring is all together in one section. I haven't mentioned this yet, but the test does go in order from chapter 1 up through chapter 6, which I think makes it a little bit easier to work with. And the chapter that you are about to take a test on. First thing you need to know on the final is synthetic substitution. So that's when we set up our synthetic division and our box number was at whatever we were substituting in for x. Our final number was whatever our y value was. There definitely are some problems that are going to ask you to find either the real solutions or sometimes it'll ask for all solutions. And that was using either factoring or using synthetic division. Okay, so I know we just practiced this a ton, but make sure we know how to do both of those things. We also need to know polynomial division, and the one that we are going to have to deal with is actually one that you can use synthetic division on. So synthetic, 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 it keeps coming up again and again and again. Make sure we know this concept. Finally, make sure we know how to find possible rational zeros. And we use this when we were solving using synthetic division. So this gives us an overview of the concepts we really need to make sure we master. The final thing I'm going to talk about is I'm specifically going to tell you which concepts you need to know for our free response section. So all of these are concepts that I already listed, but I specifically want to stress that all your work is being graded on these specific concepts. First is Martian math. So that's our chart stuff. Second is X star Y. Yes, a lot of the tougher concepts are on here. Thirdly, there is a 2x2 system. It'll allow you to solve using whatever method you want. There's also a 3x3 system. You can use whatever method you want. Our distance equals rate times time problem will be on here, in addition to graphing a parabola, where you will need to know how to complete the square and list the 4 characteristics. 7 and 8 will deal with our current chapter, and those are both solving using synthetic division, but I'm going to be really nice and actually give you guys a 0 of the function to start with. So hopefully this quick overview just informs you as to what you need to know for our final exam. Please come and see me if you have questions. Use our review time, both in class and our study session, to your advantage. And also use all the videos that are posted as an additional study tool.